Hi, all. I'm Professor Tina Good. And as we move on to our next story, I wanted to share some final thoughts about A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as we wrap up this story. Okay, so A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. The first thing that we have to consider is, why is it called A Rose for Emily? Right? I mean, it's the title of the story, and yet we never see a rose in the story. So, what is going on there? It's something that we should pay attention to, right? And the first thing that we're going to think about is, since there's not a rose in there, we must be speaking metaphorically, right? Is the story a rose for Emily? What is the rose for Emily? Let's see if we can answer that by the end of this discussion. All right, so the we've talked about Gothic in a general sense, but this story is actually from the genre of American Southern Gothic. Okay, and so Southern Gothic really contains many of the principles that we talked about with Edgar Allan Poe, right? But maybe a little more towards madness and a little less towards the supernatural. I'll let you decide that as you continue to read Southern Gothic stories. Um, but also, Southern Gothic is actually much more gritty, right? It really blurs the lines of realism and romanticism, so that we believe that this story could actually happen, right? That it has this grittiness to it, this reality to it. That even though it deals with extreme emotions, extreme situations. Yet it's still sort of, we believe that this could actually happen, right? So while Gothic does, lend itself more towards romanticism, Southern Gothic does become a little bit more gritty. And as with all Gothic, Southern Gothic does have some sort of subversive or hidden message to it. So we have to ask, what we know this is Southern Gothic. So, what is the subversive message within A Rose for Emily? What message would somebody like William Faulkner, a Nobel Prize winner, feel that he needed to confront through his stories, but yet wanted to hide it for some reason from the masses, right? And yet, give us clues, as we go through that. Listen, this is what those of you who care, right? Why I want you to pay attention to. All right. So what are some of the subversive clues that there is a hidden message in this story? And the first thing we notice is that the narrative structure is very different than what you might be used to reading. Right? It's not a linear story. First this happened, then this happened, and this happened. In fact, it's kind of hard to figure out. When you're reading it, like, where are we? What year are we in? How old is Emily? It just goes back and forth. It's not even necessarily a flashback. It's really sort of on the verge of what we call a postmodern narrative. Faulkner's writing prior to the postmodern time, but yet he's sort of hinting towards that with his narrative structure, and it really jars us, and we really have to pay attention to the narrative structure, or we're going to lose our place in what's happening. The narrator is also very interesting, right? It's first person plural. It's actually the town is narrating, not a particular person in the town, but the town, the we of the town. Is very unusual, right? Could a we actually tell a story, right? And so we have to kind of pay attention to the perspective of this narrator, right? Can we trust this narrator if it's covering up who's actually telling the story by saying we, right? Is actually very unclear as who the protagonist and the antagonist characters are, right? I mean, there's very few characters, right? There's Emily, there's the town as a we, right? There's a moment with the druggist, Homer, and of course Toby, right? There's the Baptist minister, has a little scene in there, but there's very few characters, and we focus mostly on Emily and the town. But who's the protagonist, right? We would think it might be Emily. She's the titular character, but maybe she's the antagonist to the town, or maybe the antagonist is the town to Emily, the protagonist. Very hard to discern who that is because we don't really see any of the characters developing, right? They're essentially flat characters, right? If they have an arc, we don't actually see it in the story. If there is a climax to the story, it doesn't happen explicitly within the narrative, right? If it were a play, we would say if there is a climax, it's happening off stage, which again is very unusual narrative structure. So this forces us to really focus on the metaphors. Like I said, like the rose is telling us, focus on the metaphors within the play. And if our characters are flat characters, then we have to consider them as either stereotypes or metaphorical. And for the purpose of this discussion, I'm suggesting to you that we need to consider the characters both on the literal level, right? What they are doing in the story, but also the metaphorical level. So if we take a look at the metaphorical level, we look at Emily. Emily is our Southern Belle, right? If it would have been pre-Civil War, she would have been the Southern Belle, on a plantation system. So we might think of Emily as sort of metaphorical for the Old South, right? With the plantation system in place. And of course, rooted in that slavery system that was able to sustain the plantation system. It was disrupted, of course, with the Civil War and the freedom of the slaves. The town you might consider representing the present day South at that time, right? The post Civil War South, right? And what they are doing, right, in reaction to the Civil War and reaction to, right, their history of pre-Civil War. Homer, we might consider, post Civil War North, right? And if you know your history at all and how the North came down and sort of, sort of sacked, if you will, the South and really kind of destroyed the South and its economic system. The North could be considered here in when we think about how the South is thinking of the North with regard to our character Homer. And Toby, of course, is our Black man, not a slave, right? But probably coming out of the slavery system, in some way, either as a child during the slavery system, who was freed, or whose parents were a part of the slavery system, and he might be representing um, post Civil War Black South. And you'll notice that, right, I've slashed that idea of his name to be, right? So that there is this sort of prophecy sort of happening. Like we don't know what's going to happen, what is going to happen with the Black South, right? We know how it is at this time, but this idea that it's going to remain this way, Faulkner's suggesting in that name, we don't know what is to be of the Black South. Right. And of course, we want to take a look at the themes, right? And we have two major themes going on here that I want you to pay attention to. And that is this constant reference to covering things up, right? So Colonel Sartoris, he covers up Emily's lack of money and inability to pay the taxes after the Civil War and after her father has died. And he makes up this story, right, so that Emily can keep her, sort of dignity, and he covers it up and he says, "Listen, your father loaned the town money, and instead of the town paying it back, you no longer have to pay taxes," right? Which is a total, story that is made up to benefit Emily. And then there, of course, is the town, right? The druggist. So Emily goes in and she says she wants to buy poison, and the druggist says, "Well, okay, but you have to tell me what the poison's for," and she refuses to do so. And so then he writes on the bag for rats. Of course, he doesn't know that it's for rats, so he covers it up, right, in order to sell Emily the poison and yet get himself out of trouble. And then there's that idea of the smell, right? The smell coming from Emily's house. And they don't want to tell Emily, they don't want to tell a lady that she smells. So they go in, they sneak in and they try to destroy the smell by spreading lime, which is supposed to, sort of, you know, break down whatever is smelling. Of course, it doesn't work because we know that it's now, Homer's body who's upstairs, right? And of course, they're not really covering up because Emily sees what they're doing. So this very act, pretending to go in and cover up the smell when they very well know that this is the smell of a body. They know that Homer has gone in and hasn't come out. They know that Emily has bought poison. They try to cover it up. So this idea of like finding that hidden message, right? Faulkner is sending us messages, sending us clues. Listen, I'm covering something up here. This is a major theme. Covering it up. What are we covering up? Right? This idea that they're covering up some kind of perversion, right? Perversion is another theme, right? This idea of this relationship between Emily and her father seems very perverse, right? That he sends all of her suitors away and he has this great dominance over Emily, this perverse relationship between them. And of course, that ending scene, right, where they discover Homer's body and the long gray hair laying next to it. Not only suggesting that Emily has killed Homer and that, you know, she's pretended to be married to him and sleep with him and do whatever else with his dead body, right? It's this perversion. But on top of it is this total lack of empathy on the part of the town, right? I mean, the town itself is covering up everything that they know is going on, and yet they go in and they try to get these taxes from Emily. For what reason? For what reason, right? There's this total lack of empathy on the part of the town that when she buys the poison, they hope that, she's going to kill herself and that would take care of it. And they go to the funeral at the end, to like not pay respects to Emily, but kind of, gossip about it and maybe have some sort of duty, right? So we have all of these clues, right? That is suggesting there is a hidden message, right? That we have the in-your-face message of this lack of empathy for Emily and this sort of class system that's being exposed and the harm of that, class system, both before, during, and after, right? But then there is this hidden message, right? This rose, right? And so if we take a look at that, what is the hidden message? Right? If we take a look at Rose, as we've discussed before, Rose is often, some people have thought like, oh, like you would lay roses down at her funeral, right? So it's this idea of love or compassion or idea of if it's at the funeral, like the town has some sort of responsibility for remembering, right, Emily, a monument, if you will, to Emily. If we think about her as Old South, right? What are we supposed to remember? What is that monument to? And what is the danger, right? The town covering up, right? Their history, right? They're pretending like it didn't happen and trying to cover it up, trying to cover up the smell, right, of their history, right? Of their economic system prior to the Civil War and this responsibility, right, to the slave trade and the ownership of slaves and the exploitation of slaves and trying to cover that up, right? But that instead, perhaps not only owning it, but like going like maybe we have to take responsibility for it. This love and compassion, right? For not only what was the South, right? Because if we don't, they turn into this monstrosity that Emily turns into, right? And then we have to think about Toby, right? And this warning. If we don't, right, care for the Black South, right? And if we don't, if the town doesn't, right, provide some kind of empowerment, quality, there's this warning of what is to be of the Black South. Now, why hide this? Why hide it? Do you imagine that this would have been a very difficult message for the general masses of the South to consider at the time? Right? Even the North to consider at the time that there should be sort of compassion, empathy for the Old South, and that there's a responsibility to the Black South. Ah, maybe that was a dangerous message that only those who cared, those who took the time to explore the metaphors of this very, very creepy and yet entertaining story, right? Only Faulkner wanted those who cared enough to explore the story more, to discover that message. Okay, so I hope you find these final thoughts useful and that you will continue to explore the metaphors, especially in Gothic stories, in order to find not only the literal message, but also the hidden message, which may be actually more important. Have a good day.